Welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. Today we have an honor to have as our guest Andrei Liebich, who is an honorary professor of international history and politics at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He was teaching there since 1989. He also was a professor of political science at University of Québec in Montréal, as well as McGill, Fribourg, and he held research appointments in Oxford, Harvard University, Hoover Institution, Stanford. He's one of the main experts on the policies in and around Central and Eastern European countries. His specialty is the issue of nationalities and the nation building in that area. Professor, welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
Well, as you know, the reason we invited you to speak to us is your article that you published in Switzerland, and where you basically said that Putin is the most appropriate person for Russia at this time, and that Putin deserves help because he is confronted, according to you, to rising Russian nationalist chauvinist tide. Am I reading you correctly?
You are.
Could you please then let us know what is the basis for your assessment, and please describe the situation in Russia the way you see it at this time?
I think we should look at Russia the way it is and not the way we would want it to be. We see in Russia itself the power of the Russian Orthodox Church. We see rising nationalism in the Russian republics as a counter perhaps to nationalism in the Islamic republics. We see ideologues who make a big issue out of ethnic Russian identity, and Putin finds himself balloted by these currents. I don't think that Putin himself is at heart as much of a nationalist as some of the people whom he's confronted with. I think his instincts were to be a Westernizer. He wanted very much to have a good relationship with the United States. He wanted to, when that failed, he wanted to have a good relationship with the European Union. That failed as well. And he's found himself now confronted with a country where nationalism has in fact exceeded him. He's moving along with the tide, and he's given himself over to nationalist overtures. I think that the Western policy of isolating Russia is harmful. Historically, isolation of Russia has been a mistake. Russia was isolated after 1815, after 1945, and these were not happy times for the Russians. In fact, Putin has already shown that he has scant regard for what is happening in the West, and in doing so, he's pursuing not so much his own instincts as those of the people around him. The people around him are rabid nationalists. That's the case of youth who want to see Russia as a great power once again. In this respect, Putin goes along with them, but perhaps not for the same reasons. Putin would want Russia to be treated with respect by the West, whereas the Russian nationalists who are strong in his country would want Russia to emerge as a sort of marking point for world thought about cultural issues, identity issues, and so on. So I think that Putin is in fact not as strong a leader as we would want him to be, or as we would present him here. He has to compromise with people around him. The people around him are increasingly nationalist. His greatest achievement from the point of view of his public opinion was the seizure of Crimea, which raised his popularity immensely. He's been less successful in Syria, but that too is something that makes Russians proud, that Russia has saved a regime in Syria, whatever we may think of that. He's considered to have been soft on the Ukraine issue. That's not the way we see it here. Many Russian nationalists would think that Putin should have annexed the breakaway republics in the east of Ukraine. They think that Russian forces should have taken over the whole coast of the Black Sea. In short, Putin is under pressure from extreme nationalist forces, which he is joining reluctantly. And he would much prefer to have an alliance with the West rather than find himself in the situation today where he is under pressure from his nationalists and obliged to look towards China as an ally, which is not Russia's first choice at all.
Well, this is not a very pretty picture. Professor, given what you just said, the question arises, why do you advocate Crimea and other issues than the Russian chauvinists in which you say surround Putin will celebrate, because they will say, you see, it's thanks to us that you were getting everything that we're asking for.
At present, everything that goes wrong in Russia is being blamed on sanctions, which is a very uncomfortable position for those who want to bring Russia closer to the West. And in fact, if Russia is integrated into the West, it will have a much stronger position vis-à-vis its own nationalists. For instance, in the Council of Europe, Russia has had a prominent position. It has had cases referred to the European Court of Human Rights. It has respected these decisions. It's being kicked out of the Council of Europe. And the result will be that repression will go unpunished in Russia. In terms of Russia being excluded from groups such as the G7 or G8, that too has had a negative impact on Russia. It's provided grist to the mill of those who think that Russia is should remain independent, should be opposed to the whole world, which is not, I think, Putin's viewpoint. Putin would want to see Russia integrated into the world economy, into world politics, as a respected member of the international community. One of the problems of Russia is that it's no longer the superpower it once was, but it's not willing to accept a position as simply a second-rate banana republic, which is dependent on the goodwill of the United States or other countries. It would want to be a partner. It would want to be a member of the international community, not a pariah. As for Crimea, there are ways of accepting the situation in Crimea without recognizing Russian annexation. For instance, during the Cold War, American policy was not to recognize the seizure of the Baltic republics. So there were embassies of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in Washington throughout the whole Cold War. American ambassadors were not allowed to go to the Baltic republics, not to give any pretense of recognition. A policy of this sort could be applied to Crimea as well. And yet there were agreements, and yet there was cooperation between Russia and the United States. So this is, I think, the solution to the Crimean problem, which is indeed a major problem, because that's the crisis which provoked the West and created the present Russophobia, which has enveloped the United States and other Western countries.
I agree with you on the issue of Crimea. Crimea was never Ukrainian territory until 1954, when the Soviet Union did not even have an inkling of the idea that it one day will fall apart, and Khrushchev was able to just give it whatever he wanted to anybody he wanted in terms of territory. Now it's different. Russia is a great power and wants to continue to be a great power. Ukrainian does not have that pretense. Ukraine just wants to be free and independent. And the United States is responsible for making sure that Ukraine is free and independent. Russia, when looking at Ukraine, just goes absolutely nuts.
Yes.
It's very obsessive with them.
There is a problem with Ukraine in Russian mentality. Many Russians consider Ukrainians as simply Russians, or as they used to call them, little Russians. And that is a problem. But Russia has recognized independent Ukraine. There was a Russian embassy in Kiev. Russia wanted to have state-to-state relations with Ukraine. It didn't want to have Ukraine as an outpost of NATO or of Western policy against it, because it has a very long border with Ukraine, and because Ukraine is far too close to Russia. So I think Russia is prepared to accept Ukrainian independence. It's not prepared to accept Ukraine as a Western fief. In some ways, the partition of Ukraine would be a solution. In other words, Ukraine would be a neutral country which might wish to have closer relations with the West, but knows that there are limits to it. Separate and even anti-American, but it isn't, because it realizes that the United States is its closest neighbor, and it doesn't want to alarm the United States. Quebecois separatists and independentists made a great point of saying that an independent Quebec would not invite the Soviet Union. It wouldn't be a Cuba. It wouldn't alarm the United States in the least. It wouldn't allow foreign troops or ships to go down the St. Lawrence. All this out of respect for the sensibilities of Washington. I think Ukraine should have the same respect.
I think Ukraine has more than respect. Ukraine has a great fear of Russia, but my question to you is, in terms of attitude, assessing attitude of Russia toward Ukraine, if Russia actually, maybe Russia can tolerate independent Ukraine, but can really Russia accept free Ukraine? I mean, like, for example, right now we see free democratic elections, nothing close to which Russia ever has come in the, after Yeltsin, even before, during Yeltsin.
Yes, the example of Ukraine might be a problem for Russia, but it all depends really on how Zelensky plays his cards. At present, the idea that anyone could be president has already been shown in the United States and has been shown now in Ukraine. That's an uncomfortable message for Russia. But much more uncomfortable would be the idea that Ukraine would be a launching pad for invasion of Russia. And that's really what we're talking about. Russia can tolerate a different system in Ukraine. It can tolerate Ukrainian independence, but it would be very reluctant Ukraine as a launching pad for Western intervention. And that's the direction in which Ukraine was going under Poroshenko.
Well,
right. Russia would have reason to fear the example of a free election in Ukraine, sure, but it would have much more reason to fear Ukraine as a launching pad for Western intervention. Russia can deal with an independent Ukraine as it has dealt with an independent and, in fact, Western-oriented and now EU member Finland, and it would consider a neutral Ukraine to be a satisfactory solution. Sure, there is a popular sentiment in Russia that Ukrainians are not really different from us. A sentiment which is developed by the fact that there are many families which are Russian and Ukrainian. Many Ukrainians speak Russian. Most, in fact, there are many books which come in Russian, and that's why Russians feel very close to Ukrainians. They're willing to give them a free and independent state, but they don't want this to be a hostile state. That's the essential element.
I do not know why you're saying about this hostility toward Russia. As I said, first of all, Ukrainians have not shown any hostility toward Russia whatsoever. Russia has shown hostility toward Ukraine. Ukraine has not shown. If Ukraine is moving toward the Europe or United States, it's only to seek the protection. Let's not forget, Ukraine is the only country in the world that voluntarily, albeit because of the situation, gave up nuclear weapons. No other country has done it until this time. Ukraine wants to have peace with Russia. Russia does not want to have independent and free Ukraine, at least the way I read by watching Russian TV.
Well, as for the nuclear weapons, yes, Ukraine gave up its Soviet-era nuclear weapons, in part because it wasn't able to use them. They were quite useless on Ukrainian and, for that matter, on Kazakh territory. So it wasn't really much of an abandonment. As for hostility, well, Poroshenko, who has now been defeated, has made a great deal of Russian hostility towards Ukraine. He's forbidden Russian males to travel to Ukraine. He's declared Ukraine to be an aggressor. In his last elections, there were 3 million Ukrainians in Russia who weren't allowed to vote because the Ukrainian Republic wouldn't open voting booths in an aggressor state. One of Poroshenko's last moves has been to declare the Ukrainian language the sole language, sole official language of the country. This has hurt, by the way, not only Russian speakers, but Hungarian speakers in the extreme west of the country. So there has been an effort on the part of Ukraine to label Russia as an aggressor and to develop hostility towards Russia. Not terribly successfully, because Poroshenko was defeated. In fact, many Ukrainians believe that good relations with Russia would be normal. Many Ukrainians worked in Russia at a time when Russia was prospering, And in fact, Ukraine now has a much lower standard of living than Russia does. So there are many reasons for Ukrainians to feel close to Russia. And the policy of the authorities and the extreme right wing in Ukraine has been to promote hostility towards Russia. And this apparently hasn't succeeded terribly well because of the defeat of Poroshenko, as we saw now. Poroshenko made a point of labeling Russia as an aggressor, decrying any moves towards agreements with Moscow. In fact, he went much further than most of his compatriots did. He was very proud to have obtained an independent status for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. No, not much theology involved there.
You see, Andre, the things that you just outlined in terms of elements of aggression on the part of Ukraine with regard to Russia, I see simply as elements of the nation-building policies of Poroshenko. I do not see it as threatening Russia's integrity or attacking Russia in any way that would be inappropriate.
Yes, until until recent years, Ukrainians considered themselves, in the first instance, as part of the great Slavic family, great Eastern Slavic family. Since the Maidan events of 2014, they have seen themselves increasingly as a nation in confrontation with another neighbor. You're right that the war in the East has been a nation-building experience for Ukrainians. There are many more Ukrainians now who are proud to be Ukrainian, who refuse to speak Russian, than there were before. But I mean, do we want this process to come to a culmination with a conflict between Russia and Ukraine? No, I don't think we do.
I agree with you. The question is, we do not want the conflict. Ukrainians do not want the conflict because Ukrainians are in much weaker position than Russia, and they know that any possible, God forbid, war between Russia and Ukraine would be very horrible, would carry with it very horrible consequences, first of all, to Ukraine. So Ukrainians are fully cognizant of it. The issue that I want to clarify here is what should be the position of Europe and the United States with regard to Russia. Now, I agreed with you that Putin today, of all people in Russia that I see, is the most, at least for me, the most preferred leader that Russia could have. The people that probably will come after Putin will be much worse, meaning much more toward the fascist, nationalist, chauvinist side of Russian mentality.
Yes,
I see.
And one of the tragedies of this present conflict is that it's developed Ukrainian chauvinism, but it's also developed Russian chauvinism. Russians now see Ukrainians as enemies. Ukrainians see Russians as enemies, and that is not a good development at all.
I agree with you 100%. The question is, what needs to be done? You advocate steps toward removal of sanctions, removal of any acts of hostility toward Russia. But those sanctions and those acts of hostility were instituted because of things that Russia has done, not because of things that anybody else done. You know, when there was Soviet Union during Reagan administration, I was one of the few voices, probably the only voice that was from the former Soviet Union that advocated the policy similar to yours. But the way I see it, the difference between my position at that time and your position now is that at that time, I saw Soviet Union in a process of collapsing. And I did not want the external factors to buttress the so-called patriotic or nationalist forces within that country. Today, you say that Russia has nothing but those patriotic nationalist forces, and the only thing that steps on the way, pushes them back a little bit is the president of Russia, Putin. Now, in such situation, the way I see it, the only proper action is to increase the confrontation in order to increase the cost of doing what Russia is doing.
I don't see things quite in the same way. I think that if the West shows a friendlier face towards Putin, then Western influence will be greater. We'll have more exchanges. We'll see more of a Western presence in Russia, and the instincts of people like Putin will perhaps prevail over the others. They may or they may not. The case is that when Putin leaves power in 2024, if he were to leave now, it would be open territory for the nationalists. Between now and 2024, if he is able to make a case that the West is not hostile to Russia, that the West wants to integrate Russia, that the West wants to send its people and its information, such as it is, to Russia, then the forces of pro-Western feeling will be strengthened. This is particularly the case with respect to the European Union. The Russians have always and have long dreamed of closeness to Western Europe. This is being shut off from them for them now. They might have given up on the United States, but they haven't given up on Western Europe, on the European Union. And in that respect, there is a lot that can be done to further relations between the European Union and Russia. For instance, Russia could be admitted to, Russians could be admitted to travel in Western Europe. The list of people who are prevented from traveling is growing. Russia is sensitive to opinion abroad and will be more so if sanctions are eased. At present, everything that goes wrong in Russia is blamed on the sanctions. Well,
there's no prohibition on travel by average Russian to Europe, is there?
No, but lots of Russian capital, which fled Russia because it's not a rule of law, because it's uncertain, is now being repatriated because it's even more uncertain in the West. Russian accounts are being confiscated. Individual Russians are being prevented from traveling or from coming to the West. This is not a wise policy, it seems to me. One of the things that inspired Gorbachev years ago was precisely his experience of traveling in the West. He saw that things there were different, and they could be different in the Soviet Union as well. Putin himself lived in Germany, East Germany to be sure, for years.
The fact that Russians, including Putin, want better relations with Europe and the United States is granted. There's no doubt. That's not what I'm asking you about. I agree with you 100% of it. And I do agree that Putin needs help. the only problem for me is to give in. So okay, so Russia takes Crimea. You know the Kulikova Pole. By Zhana whatever, and she sings before Russia took Crimea. She said, Crimea first, then Constantinople, which is Istanbul, and
Yes,
then Jerusalem. Russia is already on a border with Jerusalem.
Yes.
Thanks to the Obama administration, thanks to American policies.
I don't think that Russia has the ambition of reconquering its empire. During the First World War, Constantinople was promised to the Russian imperial state, and it wasn't given to the Russian imperial state only because of the October Revolution. I don't think that this is in the cards today. I think Russia would be quite content to govern its own country and to be surrounded by countries which are not hostile to it, which maybe have their own practices, but are not visibly in the hands of its enemies.
Who do you see in Russia? Which segments of population? Because in your article, you said that practically all political parties now national chauvinists.
Mm-hmm.
So which are the parties that are not? Which are the parties that talk about democracy within Russia other than Navalny? Where do you see those democratic forces?
For the moment, they are subordinate and weak, in part because democracy has been discredited during the Yeltsin years. But Putin would have now several years to let these forces develop. I don't have a great faith in Navalny himself, who has a past as a right-wing nationalist and who supported the annexation of Crimea. But moderate nationalists, people who would accept the situation in Ukraine as a neutral country, who would commit themselves to only financial economic domination of the former Soviet bloc, who would allow Central Asian immigrants to come to Russia. These are the people whom we can count on. And there are people like that in Russia, but at the moment their voices are being silenced and they don't have a representation.
So you think that if the West is going to remove sanctions and everything like this, then those voices are going to become strong in Russia? My feeling is that the Russian nationalists will become even stronger because they see that they're winning.
Not yet, no. Their main argument is that the whole world is hostile to us. If the whole world is not hostile to us, they're deprived of their main argument. If they see the West as being forthcoming, as being friendly to Russia, or if not friendly, at least neutral towards Russia, then they would be deprived of their main plank, which is that Russia has always defeated its enemies, and it will defeat its enemies in the future. That's not a policy which we want to promote.
Okay. Well, I wanna thank you very much, Andre, for your time and for your wisdom, for your contribution to this discussion. What we're gonna do when we're gonna put this thing on YouTube, we're gonna also put a link, with your permission, to your report that you made in English in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. And so people will be able to read it as you wrote it and consider the points that you are making. Now, as I said, my attitude toward it is a little bit different. I'm not sure on the on what the United States should do. I do agree with you on the fact that Putin, at least still for now, is the most appropriate leader for Russia. I do not know what is going to be happening in the future, but the policy of the United States, I do not see. If there would be in Russia, some forces that could be counted, but I do not see any forces. I mean, even if Navalny is not a force, and I agree with you with your assessment of Navalny. I agree with you on everything that you said, you know, in terms of, but I do not know if the prescription is correct. And I know only one thing, that Russia cannot tolerate, it can tolerate independent Ukraine, but it cannot tolerate free Ukraine.
Well, we disagree on that, but we agree on everything else. That Putin will have only a few more years in power. And in those years, we should try to develop a working relationship with Russia. We don't need to be friends with Russia. We don't need to cave in to the demands of Russia, but we should encourage exchanges. We should respect Russia in the way that Russia wants to be respected. And one of the surprising elements of Russian opinion is that the amount of the division of the United States has declined very quickly and very rapidly. It can rise equally rapidly.
I agree with you. You know, I liked your idea that the United States should establish, with regard to Russia and Crimea, the same relationship or the same attitude that the United States had toward Baltic republics during the Soviet period. I mean, we cannot allow the capture of Crimea to place a block on the general relations between West and East.
Absolutely.
In such a way. So,
absolutely. Yes. We shouldn't let Crimea become the touchstone of relations between Russia and the rest of the world.
I agree with you on
Crimea
that.
is a problem. Yes, but we have other interests, and those are the ones we should pursue.
But there's also, you know, areas and the war in the east of Ukraine, and there's general virulent hostility of Russia toward Ukraine. I mean, the Russian politicians talk with the saliva dripping from the both ends of their mouth when they talk about Ukraine, and they talk about Ukraine all the time.
Yes, but isn't it important that Putin has not annexed Luhansk and Donetsk, even though he has been under great pressure to do so? Isn't it important that he hasn't invaded Mariupol as some Russian nationalists would want him to? In fact, he's maintained a position which is considered moderate in Russia, which is not considered moderate here, and we're not helping him to maintain that position.
Yes, he has not done those things that you just mentioned, but the question is whether he has not done it because he is afraid of more sanctions, or he has not done it because he is such a nice guy.
Well, I mean, I don't think he's a nice guy. I think he's a politician who wants to make his country an important world player. I don't think he's really afraid of more sanctions, because if there were more sanctions, what would they be? I mean, what could be all kinds
of, there could be all kinds of more sanctions. I mean, under
yes, Europe is dependent on Russian energy. Maybe Europe would follow American pressure and have the same policy towards Russia as it has towards Iran, say, or towards Venezuela. But I don't think that would work in the case of Russia.
You may be right. I do not know the future. But the thing is, I know that to let somebody who is doing bad thing to keep on doing it and give them something as if they're not doing it is not the right approach.
Yes. Well, the first thing to do is to observe the Minsk process, to give autonomy to the eastern provinces of Ukraine, which has been turned down by the Ukrainian parliament because it sees this as the edge of the Russian sword in Ukraine. But in fact, it would mean that Ukraine would recognize the facts that these are republics which are Russian-speaking, which feel closer to Russia than to Ukraine in many cases, but which are prepared to be part of Ukraine, and well, even if they have a veto on Ukrainian policy.
Those areas are part of the territory of Ukraine, and it's up to Ukraine
Yes.
to decide whether it wants to allow cultural autonomy in those areas. I personally would allow cultural autonomy, but not in the way that those Russian nationalists in those areas demand. But that is not for me to decide. It's for people in Ukraine to decide, for Parliament of Ukraine. They can change their mind today this way, tomorrow that the other way. I do not know. Maybe at one point they'll decide, let them go to Putin completely. Putin is now giving the passports to those people and everything else. So maybe Ukrainians will say, we do not want those areas at all in Ukraine. So let them secede.
Yes.
We do not.
Well, we've heard that sort of argument, but it's been turned down by Ukrainian nationalists who want to reconquer these areas by force if necessary. And since they don't have the force themselves, they are counting on NATO to help them. And that's a very dangerous scenario.
But NATO cannot provide Ukraine the force that Ukraine may need to confront Russia. It's just simply not there, will not be there.
Well, not for the moment, but it's already giving arms, and it has training. It has soldiers who are training. It would take a minor incident for NATO forces to enter Ukraine and to take back Luhansk and Donetsk, which is what Ukraine would want, what Kiev would want, and which would be a blow to Russia, of course.
So basically, the prescription should be let's remove the sanctions against Russia and against people around Putin, and not do anything for what they're doing.
No. The solution would be to put pressure on Ukraine to solve its problems with the Russians, and once Ukraine's problems with the Russians are solved, then gradually we would install relations with Russia. We wouldn't need to do so all at once, but we could do so in steps. For instance, if the Minsk Accords are accepted, we could remove some of the most vicious sanctions. Trade relations, for instance, with Russia could recover. There would be objections from the Baltic countries, from Poland, but these could be overcome, and Russia and the United States could sign treaties once again on limiting nuclear armaments, on confidence-building measures. All this would be very helpful to improving Russian-American relations.
Well, I guess we'll need to continue this conversation, especially because this is the same conversation that we were having in the United States, 40 years ago. I mean, like during the Cold War.
Yes, but we can't expect Russia to collapse the way the Soviet Union collapsed. In fact, Russia is still the largest country in the world. It still considers itself a powerful country. It still has nuclear weapons. That is the only nuclear power that can compete with the United States. All this means that we can't expect a replay of the Soviet experience. Not only can we not expect that, but we can't expect the United States to be as powerful as it was in 1991, 1992, when in fact it ruled the world. And some people in the United States still think that that's the case, but it no longer is. We are confronted with weakening America, which has to find fields of agreement with not only its allies, but with its enemies. At present, we are pushing Russia into the hands of China, which is much more of a dangerous procedure than removing sanctions and dealing with Russia as it is.
But Russia has been moving toward China for a long, long time, long before sanctions. I mean, because Russia is a very aggressive society. I mean, it really sees itself as the world superpower, which is fine. It's a great country. It's the largest country. It's a powerful country, but it wants more land and more land and more land and more land.
Well, I think it has enough land. I mean, that's not
It does not stop it from. I mean, it does not stop Russia. You know, Kuril Islands. You know, it could have peace with Japan real easy if it would give up Kuril Islands. Just an example, Russia would not become smaller.
That's right, and Russia has suggested a compromise. It would keep 2 of the islands and give back 2 of them. The Japanese want all of them. You're right that it's a very small territorial issue, a very big symbolic issue. One of the problems is that Russia has not, or the Soviet Union did not sign a treaty, a peace treaty with Japan, and Russia has been moving towards China, yes, for a number of years, but it's an unequal relationship. China is much more powerful than Russia, and Russia is not used to being in that sort of situation. It would much rather deal with its Western counterparts than with the Chinese, who are powerful and who are unknown. I mean, if you look at Russian literature, you see that Russians always thought of the West as being somehow theirs. They never thought of China as being close to them. China is the Russo-Chinese alliance is an opportunistic one.
Look at this.
And it's
China is Asian country. Russia is part and parcel of European racist attitude toward the Asia. You know, when Russia lost the war to Japan in 1905, that was the greatest embarrassment to Russia.
Absolutely, yes. And if you complain about attitudes of Russians to Ukrainians, Russian attitudes towards the Chinese are much worse, of course. Because the Ukrainians are brothers, little brothers, whereas the Chinese are an unknown factor. So I think Russia would much prefer to be closer to the West than it is to China. And it's being prevented from pursuing its natural course by a wall of hostility in the West.
What prevents it from being closer to the West?
The hostility that exists in the West, the sanctions.
We're getting back to the first that we started, because I'm trying to, to the West. And the West just simply exhibits this hostility because of Russophobia? Why?
Well, the West, under the leadership of the United States, sees the rest of the world as being somehow subordinate to itself. Putin has shown and he has declared that Russia will not be subordinate to anyone. Russia is part of a multipolar world, and one of these poles is that of Russia itself. The European Union would like to be also a part of a multi. It's very subordinate to the United States. It's subordinate financially, subordinate militarily, and it's shown that it's not willing to go all the way in breaking with the United States.
Of course not, because it's afraid of Russia. It's afraid of Russia. I mean, right now, Europe cannot defend itself from Russia with the United States at all.
But it doesn't need to defend itself.
Does not
I
need.
mean, Russia is not keen to recover Poland and the Czech Republic and Slovakia. It has its people there who are financially important, and in fact, Eastern Europe was a burden for Russia, as were the Central Asian republics. And true Russian nationalists, the hardcore Russian nationalists, want to get rid of Islam in Russia. They want to get rid of all non-ethnic Russians. This is not a policy which Putin has favored, but towards which he is being pushed now.
Well, okay, so they got rid of Central Asia, but there's still 20% of Russian population which is Muslim. Are you saying that Russian nationalists want to get rid of those Muslims, of Tatars and everybody else?
Yes, they really would want. They're willing to give up the Caucasus. One of the main problems is Chechnya, which Russians are prepared to dispose of in order to remain ethnically pure Russians.
Russians,
yes,
Russians that for almost 200 years were fighting for Chechnya want to get rid of it?
They're prepared to do so now in order to get rid of their Muslims. And in fact, I think one of the main problems in Russia today is the fact that Putin protects the leader of Chechnya, Kadyrov, against the nationalists who would want to rid Russia of non-ethnic Russian elements. I mean, one of the main people who thought in this way was Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who has since died, but he was quite prepared to get rid of Russians, Tatars, Muslims, Jews, and others in order to remain ethnically Russian.
For Russia, the policy or the idea of expulsion of all undesirable people started before the First World War.
Well, before the First World War, they had an imperial perspective. It was a time when empires were in fashion.
Solzhenitsyn also has imperial perspective.
Yes, and he was willing to get rid of these non-ethnic Russians in order to keep Russia pure. I think this is a very dangerous idea because Russia is today one of the few truly multicultural countries which has subsisted, and well, let's hope it remains so.
Well, it will, because hopefully things are going to be going better. But in any case, Andre, it was a great pleasure. And
thank you, Alex.
Thank you for speaking to us. And as I said, once we're going to upload it on YouTube, we're going to place a link to your very interesting speech that you gave on the subject. And so people will be able to download it in English, because your main article that I was referring to was in French, and some people may not be able to read French.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.